November 15th, 1943. The iron wheels of the converted troop train scraped against frost-covered rails as it pulled into the small depot outside Algona, Iowa. Through the condensation-streaked windows, Gefreiter Klaus Mueller pressed his face against the cold glass, watching cornfields stretch endlessly under a gray Midwestern sky. The 3-year-old Wehrmacht veteran had expected many things when he surrendered to American forces in Sicily 3 months earlier, but this wasn't one of them. The train car reeked of coal smoke, unwashed uniforms, and the metallic tang of fear. 47 German prisoners sat on wooden benches, their conversation reduced to nervous whispers as American guards moved through the aisles. Mueller clutched a folded letter from his mother in Hamburg, received through the Red Cross 2 weeks ago. "Klaus," she had written, "we pray the Americans don't torture you, as the party newspapers say they will." The train lurched to a stop with a final hiss of steam. Through the depot windows, Mueller could see a small crowd of civilians bundled in heavy coats, their breath forming white clouds in the November air. American soldiers with rifles stood at attention on the platform. But something felt different from the processing centers on the East Coast. Here the guards seemed almost relaxed, and the civilians weren't shouting or throwing rocks. They simply watched, curious and silent. "Rouse! Out!" barked Sergeant William Harrison, a farm boy from Nebraska whose German was surprisingly good. The prisoners filed out of the train cars, their striped uniforms stark against the brown landscape. Mueller had lost 30 pounds since his capture. But the sea voyage and train journey had included regular meals of white bread, meat, and vegetables. More food than he'd seen during his final months fighting in Sicily. Camp Algona sprawled across 400 acres of converted farmland, its single-story wooden barracks arranged in neat rows behind chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire. Guard towers punctuated the perimeter, but they seemed functional rather than menacing. Soccer fields had been carved out between buildings, and Mueller could hear the distant sound of men singing German folk songs from one of the barracks. As the prisoners were processed through the main gate, they passed a hand-painted sign in both English and German: "Prisoner of War Camp Algona, capacity 10,000. The numbers staggered Mueller. 10,000 German soldiers, just in this one camp in Iowa. How many more camps existed across this vast country? The intake process defied every expectation shaped by Nazi propaganda. American officers, many speaking fluent German, explained the Geneva Convention rights with mechanical precision. Photographs were taken for identification cards. Medical examinations were conducted by Army doctors who treated wounds and illnesses without discrimination. Each prisoner received a canvas bag containing toiletries, writing materials, and a handbook explaining camp rules. Mueller found himself assigned to Barracks 17, a long wooden structure with rows of metal bunk beds, each equipped with mattresses, blankets, and a small footlocker. The building had electric lights, a luxury many of the prisoners hadn't enjoyed even in civilian life back in Germany. Steam radiators provided heat against the Iowa winter, and flush toilets were housed in a separate building connected by a covered walkway. The first meal in the mess hall demolished another pillar of Nazi propaganda. Long wooden tables groaned under the weight of actual meat beef stew with potatoes and carrots, served alongside white bread with real butter. Red Cross parcels contained chocolate, cigarettes, and canned goods. Men who had subsisted on turnips and black bread during their final months in combat ate until they were uncomfortably full. "They're fattening us for slaughter," muttered Unteroffizier Hans Richter, a veteran of the North African campaign who had arrived on an earlier transport. But even his cynicism couldn't mask the relief in his voice as he buttered his third slice of bread. The camp's routine quickly established itself: reveille at 0600 hours, followed by breakfast and work assignments. The Geneva Convention of 1929 authorized the use of prisoner labor for non-military tasks, and the American war effort desperately needed hands. Acute labor shortages across the agricultural Midwest meant that thousands of German prisoners would be transported daily to work on surrounding farms. Each morning, military trucks and jeeps arrived to collect work details. Groups of 1 to 3 prisoners were assigned to individual farmers, transported under guard to perform the seasonal labor that kept America fed while its young men fought overseas. The daily wage of 80 cents might have seemed modest to Americans, but for men who had owned nothing but the clothes on their backs for months, it represented unprecedented wealth. The camp canteen became a symbol of American abundance that prisoners struggled to comprehend. With their daily wages, they could purchase ice cream, Coca-Cola, magazines, cigarettes, and candy. Mueller stood paralyzed before the display cases during his first visit, overwhelmed by choices that had been unimaginable luxuries in wartime Germany. Ice cream in November, Coca-Cola whenever he wanted it, chocolate bars stacked in casual abundance. Evening brought cultural activities that transformed the camp from a prison into something resembling a small town. Prisoners produced a German-language newspaper called Der Zahn, The Fence, organized soccer matches that drew crowds of guards and local civilians, and staged theatrical performances in the camp's makeshift auditorium. Men who had been trained to kill became poets, musicians, and philosophers. The letters Mueller began writing to his family painted a picture so impossible that he feared the censors would reject them as fantasy. "Mama," he wrote in careful script, "today I bought ice cream with money I earned picking corn for an American farmer. The guard said I worked hard and gave me an extra Coca-Cola. I am gaining weight and sleeping in a warm bed with clean sheets. I think about you every day, but I must tell you, America is not what they told us." As November deepened into the Thanksgiving season, something unexpected began to happen. The farmers who employed German prisoners started to see beyond the uniforms and accents to the young men beneath. Many of these Midwestern families had German ancestry themselves, their grandparents having immigrated in the previous century. They recognized familiar words, shared customs, and common humanity. The stage was being set for encounters that would challenge every assumption about enemies and friendship, about hatred and hospitality, about the nature of war itself. In farm kitchens across Iowa, Nebraska, and Minnesota, American families were about to extend invitations that would transform not only individual lives, but the very meaning of victory and defeat. October 23, 1943. The pre-dawn darkness outside Camp Algona's gates carried the sharp bite of autumn frost as military trucks loaded with German prisoners rumbled toward their work assignments. Klaus Mueller pulled his thin prison jacket tighter as he climbed into the back of Sergeant Harrison's Jeep, joining 2 other prisoners for the 15-minute drive to the Hoffmann farm. The Hoffmann place sprawled across 320 acres of prime Iowa farmland, its white 2-story house surrounded by red barns, corn cribs, and silos that stretched toward a sky the color of old pewter. As the Jeep crunched down the gravel driveway, Mueller caught sight of a middle-aged man in work clothes waiting by the barn. Walter Hoffmann stood 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of a man who had worked the land for 30 years. His great-grandfather had emigrated from Bavaria in 1867. "Guten Morgen," Hoffmann called out as the prisoners climbed from the Jeep. His German carried the distinctive accent of the Iowa countryside, but the words were clear and warm. Mueller froze. In 3 months of captivity, no American civilian had spoken to him in his native language with anything approaching friendliness. Sergeant Harrison performed the standard introductions while keeping his rifle slung casually across his shoulder. "These boys are here to help with your corn harvest, Mr. Hoffmann. Army regulations say, I need to stay within sight, but I'll try not to get in your way." The work began immediately. October corn harvest in Iowa meant dawn to dusk labor, lifting and loading heavy ears into horse-drawn wagons that would haul the crop to storage cribs. Mueller's hands, soft from months of military rations in captivity, quickly blistered against the rough corn husks. But something unexpected happened as the morning progressed. Walter Hoffmann worked alongside the prisoners rather than simply directing their labor. He showed them efficient techniques for husking corn, shared water from his personal thermos, and spoke occasionally in a mixture of English and German. His wife Emma appeared at mid-morning with a pot of coffee and thick sandwiches made with ham and fresh cheese, food she shared equally with prisoners and guards. Mein Großvater kam aus Deutschland, Emma Hoffmann explained as she poured coffee into metal cups. Her grandfather had come from Germany, she said, from a village not 50 miles from Mueller's hometown. The coincidence hung in the autumn air like wood smoke, connecting strangers across an ocean and a war. As the days passed and work details became routine, similar encounters multiplied across the agricultural heartland. At the Nelson farm outside Fort Dodge, Unteroffizier Hans Richter found himself working alongside Harold Nelson, whose great-uncle had served in the same Prussian regiment as Richter's grandfather during the Franco-Prussian War. At the Schmidt place near Mason City, 3 German prisoners helped repair a barn, while the farmer's wife prepared lunch portions generous enough to feed twice as many men. The sensory details of farm life embedded themselves in prisoner memories with startling clarity. The metallic clank of milk pails at dawn, the warm, sweet smell of hay, mixed with the acrid tang of coal smoke from kitchen stoves, the sound of English conversation, punctuated by laughter from farmhouse porches, horse leather, and fresh manure, the crackling of corn husks, and the distant drone of military aircraft overhead. But it was the small gestures of humanity that proved most transformative. When Mueller developed a fever from working in cold rain, Emma Hoffmann insisted he rest in her kitchen while she prepared a hot meal of chicken soup and fresh bread. When Hans Richter accidentally cut his hand on a piece of farm equipment, Harold Nelson cleaned and bandaged the wound with the same care he would have shown his own son. These encounters violated every assumption the prisoners carried about American attitudes toward Germans. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as mongrel weaklings, dominated by Jewish conspirators who would torture and humiliate captured Aryan soldiers. Yet here were farmers, treating enemy prisoners with casual kindness, sharing food and shelter, speaking German phrases learned from immigrant grandparents. The prisoners' letters home began reflecting this cognitive dissonance. Papa, wrote Obergefreiter Friedrich Bauer from his assignment at a turkey farm near Ames, the American family I work for has photographs of sons in the army fighting against our soldiers in Italy. Yet they invited me to sit at their table for the noon meal. The woman packed extra food for me to take back to camp. I cannot understand this kindness toward enemies. Sergeant Harrison, who had grown up on a farm 30 miles from Camp Algona, observed the transformation with professional interest. His assignment was to prevent escapes and ensure productive labor, but he found himself fascinated by the gradual breaking down of barriers between prisoners and civilians. In his weekly reports to camp commanders, he noted increasing cooperation from work details and growing friendships between guards and prisoners. The approach of Thanksgiving created an unexpected dynamic. American farmers began mentioning the upcoming holiday to their German workers, explaining traditions of family gatherings, abundant meals, and expressions of gratitude. For prisoners who had grown up in a culture where major holidays were increasingly militarized by Nazi ideology, the concept of a purely civilian celebration, centered on food and family, proved intriguing. Emma Hoffmann found herself explaining Thanksgiving to Mueller as they husked corn in the October sunshine. "It's our most American holiday," she said in her careful German. "No kings, no soldiers, just families coming together to share what God has provided. My grandmother used to make 20 pies for Thanksgiving dinner when all the cousins came." The abundance she described seemed impossible to men who had grown up with rationing, wartime shortages, and Nazi ideology that celebrated struggle and sacrifice above comfort. 20 pies for a single meal, fresh turkey weighing 20 pounds, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, multiple vegetables, fresh rolls with butter. As November progressed, something unprecedented began to happen. American farming families started discussing whether to invite their German workers to join Thanksgiving celebrations. The conversations took place in farmhouse kitchens across Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Kansas, usually between husbands and wives struggling with conflicting emotions. "These boys are somebody's sons," Emma Hoffmann told her husband as they planned their Thanksgiving menu. "Klaus showed me a photograph of his mother. She looks just like your sister Helen. How can we feast while they sit in that camp, eating from tin plates?" Similar conversations played out in dozens of rural communities. The Nelsons debated whether their neighbors would approve of Germans at their dinner table. The Schmidts worried about their son fighting in the Pacific, while they considered feeding enemy soldiers. Yet something deeper than politics was at work: the fundamental Midwestern values of hospitality, Christian charity, and recognition of common humanity. The prisoners themselves remained unaware of these discussions. They continued their daily routines of work, letters home, and evening activities in camp. But whispered conversations in barracks revealed growing curiosity about American customs and increasing confusion about the nature of their enemies. "They treat us better than our own officers did," admitted Hans Richter during an evening card game in Barracks 17. The observation generated uncomfortable silence among men who had sworn oaths to the fatherland and been taught to view Americans as inferior. The stage was being set for encounters that would challenge the very foundations of Nazi ideology, not through propaganda or force, but through the simple power of an invitation to share a meal. November 22nd, 1943. The alarm clock on Walter Hoffmann's bedside table showed 4:30 a.m. when he rolled out of bed and dressed in the pre-dawn darkness. Through frost-covered windows, he could see the silhouettes of his barns against a star-filled sky. Today was different from other workdays. Today was Thanksgiving, and the Hoffmann family was about to make a decision that would be remembered for decades. Emma was already in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up as she wrestled a 20-pound turkey into the oven. The bird had been ordered from the Schoenemann farm 3 weeks earlier, part of Thanksgiving preparations that had consumed the household for days. Sweet potatoes lay scrubbed and waiting. Cranberries simmered on the back burner. Fresh rolls rose under clean towels, and 3 pumpkin pies cooled on the windowsill. "Did you decide about the boys?" Emma asked without looking up from her work. The question had been debated for a week. Should they invite Klaus Mueller and the other German prisoners who had been working their harvest? Was it legal? Was it proper? Was it Christian? Walter poured coffee from the pot that had been percolating since 4 a.m. and considered his answer. In 6 weeks of working alongside Mueller, he had discovered a young man who reminded him of his own nephew, serious, hard-working, homesick for family. The prisoner had shown Walter photographs of his mother and sister in Hamburg, describing bombing raids and food shortages with a matter-of-fact acceptance that masked obvious pain. Sergeant Harrison said it would be all right as long as he stays to supervise. Walter finally replied. He seemed to think it might be good for morale, said the camp commander approved similar arrangements at other farms. Similar conversations were taking place in farmhouses across the Midwest that morning. Harold Nelson had already made his decision 3 German prisoners would join his family for Thanksgiving dinner. The Schmidt family had prepared place settings for 2 additional guests. At the Williamson farm outside Cedar Falls, 6 prisoners who had been working corn harvest were expected at 2 p.m. Back at Camp Algona, Klaus Mueller was unaware of these preparations as he went through his normal morning routine. Reveille at 0600 hours, breakfast in the mess hall, formation for work details. The camp itself buzzed with unusual activity. It was the first major American holiday since most prisoners had arrived. and camp administrators had arranged special meals and entertainment for men who would not be working. But Mueller found himself assigned to what Sergeant Harrison mysteriously called special duty at the Hoffmann farm. As the military jeep bounced down familiar country roads, Mueller assumed he would be performing maintenance work or helping with livestock. It never occurred to him that he was driving toward an invitation that would fundamentally alter his understanding of America and Americans. The jeep turned into the Hoffmann driveway at 10 a.m., crunching over gravel still white with frost. But instead of heading toward the barns or fields, Sergeant Harrison parked near the farmhouse kitchen door. The scene that greeted Mueller defied comprehension. Emma Hoffmann stood in the doorway, wearing her best dress and a flour-dusted apron, her gray hair pinned back with unusual care. Behind her, the kitchen glowed with warmth and activity. Steam rose from multiple pots on the stove. The magnificent aroma of roasting turkey filled the air, mixed with cinnamon, sage, and fresh bread. "Klaus," Walter Hoffmann said in his careful German, "Meine Frau und ich möchten Sie zum Thanksgiving Essen einladen." The invitation hung in the cold morning air, like a challenge to everything Mueller thought he understood about war, enemies, and human nature. Sie möchten mich zum Essen einladen, Mueller stammered. They wanted to invite him to dinner? In their house? At their table? The concept seemed so impossible that he looked to Sergeant Harrison for translation or correction. "It's Thanksgiving, son," Harrison said with a grin. "Mrs. Hoffmann has been cooking since before dawn, and she says there's enough food for Sherman's army. Besides, it's not right for a young man to spend Thanksgiving alone in a camp." What followed challenged every assumption Mueller carried about American intentions. Emma Hoffmann led him to a washstand on the back porch, where he could clean his hands and face. She provided a clean towel, a real cloth towel, not the rough camp-issue version, and gestured toward the kitchen with maternal efficiency that transcended language barriers. The Hoffmann kitchen had been transformed into a cathedral of abundance. The dining table, normally used for everyday meals, had been extended with additional leaves and covered with Emma's grandmother's linen tablecloth. Place settings included real china, silver cutlery, and crystal glasses that caught the light from windows facing south. A centerpiece of autumn leaves and corn stalks created a harvest tableau that belonged in a magazine. But it was the food that struck Mueller like a physical blow. The turkey, golden and glistening with fat, occupied the center of the table like a monument to American prosperity. Around it spread dishes that represented months of careful rationing for a German family. Mashed potatoes crowned with butter, sweet potatoes glazed with brown sugar, green beans with almonds, cranberry sauce that gleamed like jewels, fresh rolls that steamed when broken open. "Setzen Sie sich, Klaus," Emma said, gesturing toward a chair that had been prepared specially for him. "Sit down, Klaus." The simple invitation carried weight that neither speaker nor listener fully understood at the moment. Walter Hoffmann carved the turkey with practiced efficiency, placing generous slices on Mueller's plate alongside portions of vegetables and dressing. The plate grew heavy with food, more food than Mueller had seen at one time since before the war. Real butter for the rolls, gravy made from turkey drippings, sweet potatoes that tasted like candy. The conversation began tentatively, with Walter and Emma asking careful questions about Mueller's family, his hometown, his life before the war. They showed photographs of their own sons, one serving in the Pacific with the Navy, another training at Fort Knox. They spoke of shared concerns about young men far from home, about mothers who worried and waited for letters. As the meal progressed, something remarkable happened. The formal barriers between prisoner and captors began dissolving into simple human connection. Mueller found himself describing Hamburg before the bombing, the small apartment where he had lived with his mother and sister, his job as a mechanic in a bicycle shop. The Hoffmanns shared stories of their own struggles during the Depression, of neighbors who had helped when crops failed, of the German-speaking community that had maintained its traditions while becoming thoroughly American. The moment that crystallized the transformation came when Emma served dessert. 3 pumpkin pies appeared on the table, alongside vanilla ice cream, coffee, and a plate of homemade cookies. As she cut generous slices, she mentioned casually that her great-grandmother's recipe came from Bavaria, the same region where Mueller's family originated. "Wir sind Familie," she said quietly. "We are family." The words hung in the warm kitchen air, challenging every Nazi teaching about racial superiority, American weakness, and the fundamental divisions between nations. Mueller's eyes filled with tears, the first time he had cried since his capture in Sicily. The emotional release came not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming recognition of kindness extended without expectation of return. These people, whose son was fighting against his countrymen, had opened their home and shared their celebration with an enemy soldier. Similar scenes were playing out across rural Iowa that afternoon. At the Nelson farm, Hans Richter was learning to carve turkey, while Harold Nelson's wife taught him English phrases for "thank you" and "delicious." At the Schmidt place, 2 prisoners helped with dishes, while the family's youngest daughter practiced her school German by describing Thanksgiving traditions. The sensory memories of these meals would remain vivid decades later. The texture of real butter spreading across warm rolls, the sound of crystal glasses clinking in toast to peace and family, the weight of silver cutlery in hands accustomed to tin mess kits, the warmth of kitchen conversations that gradually shifted from careful politeness to genuine laughter. As evening approached and the time came to return to camp, Mueller struggled to find words adequate for his gratitude. "Danke schön" seemed insufficient for an act of grace that had restored his faith in human decency. Emma Hoffmann pressed a package of leftover turkey and pie into his hands, then impulsively hugged him as she might have embraced her own son. The jeep ride back to Camp Algona passed in contemplative silence. Sergeant Harrison, who had observed dozens of similar encounters throughout the day, understood that something profound had occurred. These were not mere meals, but acts of transformation that would ripple outward in ways no military strategist could have predicted. That night, as Mueller lay in his bunk in Barracks 17, he began composing a letter to his mother that would be unlike any he had written from captivity. How could he describe a day that had challenged everything they had been taught about Americans? How could he explain kindness that seemed to flow from abundance rather than calculation? The letter would take weeks to reach Hamburg, traveling through military censors and Red Cross channels. But when it arrived, Maria Mueller would read words that began her own transformation. "Liebe Mama, today I experienced something I must share with you. The Americans are not what we were told." December 15th, 1943. The letter arrived at Klaus Mueller's barracks on a snowy Iowa morning, bearing the distinctive red stamp of the International Red Cross and his mother's careful handwriting. He had been expecting her response to his description of Thanksgiving dinner with the Hoffmann family, but nothing could have prepared him for what Maria Mueller had written from bombed Hamburg. "Mein lieber Klaus," the letter began, "your description of the American family's kindness moved me to tears. But I must tell you something that will shock you as much as your letter shocked me. Yesterday, a package arrived at our apartment. Inside were canned food, chocolate, warm socks, and a photograph of a farmhouse in Iowa. The accompanying letter was written in careful German by a woman named Emma Hoffmann, who said you had spoken of your family during Thanksgiving dinner." Mueller's hands trembled as he continued reading. Emma Hoffmann had somehow obtained his family's address and sent a care package to enemy civilians in the middle of a war. The gesture defied military logic, political sense, and everything the Nazi Party had taught about American character. Yet here was proof that one Iowa farm wife had responded to human need that transcended national boundaries. The letter continued with news that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Maria Mueller had begun corresponding with Emma Hoffmann, sharing photographs and family stories across the Atlantic Divide. 2 mothers, whose sons were fighting on opposite sides of a global war, had discovered common ground in their shared concerns about young men far from home. Similar correspondences were developing across the American Midwest as the Thanksgiving holiday's impact rippled outward. The Nelson family had established contact with Hans Richter's parents in Bremen. The Schmidt family was sending packages to families of German prisoners who had shared their holiday table. What had begun as isolated acts of hospitality was evolving into a network of human connections that ignored political boundaries. Camp Algona's administrators watched these developments with fascination and growing appreciation for their strategic value. Colonel James Patterson, the camp commander, had initially worried about civilians fraternizing with enemy prisoners. But intelligence reports from other camps suggested that kindness accomplished more than coercion in breaking down Nazi ideology and encouraging cooperation. The Special Projects Division, tasked with prisoner re-education, documented remarkable changes in attitude and behavior among prisoners who had experienced American hospitality. Men who had arrived spouting Nazi slogans were quietly requesting English lessons. Hardened Wehrmacht veterans were asking for books about American history and democratic government. Most significantly, escape attempts had dropped to virtually zero among prisoners working on local farms. The Thanksgiving invitations have accomplished something our propaganda programs couldn't achieve in months, Colonel Patterson wrote in his report to the War Department. These men are witnessing American prosperity and humanity firsthand. They're discovering that everything they were told about our country was a lie. Without realizing it, our farmers are conducting the most effective re-education program in the system. The transformation was most visible in the camp's cultural activities. The German-language newspaper, Der Sohn, gradually shifted from defiant nationalism to thoughtful discussions of democracy and Reconstruction. Articles began appearing about American agricultural methods, industrial capacity, and social mobility. Prisoners debated the merits of different political systems with an openness that would have been impossible under Nazi supervision. Mueller found himself at the center of these discussions. His experience with the Hoffmann family had made him something of a celebrity in Barracks 17, where men gathered each evening to hear him describe details of American domestic life. The abundance he had witnessed challenged fundamental Nazi teachings about resource scarcity and racial competition. "They threw away more food at that one dinner than my family sees in a month," Mueller told his bunkmates. Not to mock us, not to display superiority, but because they truly had more than they could consume. The waste was not cruel. It was simply evidence of unlimited resources. Christmas 1943 provided another opportunity for transformation. American civic organizations, churches, and schools organized massive drives to provide holiday packages for enemy prisoners. Over 50,000 Christmas parcels arrived at camps across the United States, each containing cigarettes, candy, toiletries, games, and personal letters from American families. The packages themselves amazed prisoners, but the accompanying letters provided deeper psychological impact. Children from Iowa schools had drawn pictures and written simple messages of friendship. Church groups included prayers for peace and reconciliation. Families with sons serving overseas expressed hope that enemy parents were showing similar kindness to captured American soldiers. Mueller received 3 packages from strangers, including one from a Methodist church in Cedar Falls, whose congregation had adopted his barracks for the holidays. The accompanying letter, written by the pastor's wife, included photographs of the church social hall, where dozens of women had assembled, packages while singing Christmas carols in English and German. The Christmas Eve service at Camp Algona became a moment of profound spiritual significance. American chaplains conducted services in both English and German, with local church choirs performing traditional carols. The camp's own German prisoners had organized a nativity pageant, complete with hand-carved figures and costumes made from available materials. As Silent Night echoed across the snow-covered compound, sung simultaneously in English and German, something approaching catharsis occurred. Men who had been trained to view Americans as enemies found themselves sharing a sacred moment that emphasized common humanity rather than national divisions. The deepest transformation came through continued work assignments on local farms. As winter gave way to spring planting season, prisoners who had spent months working alongside American families began adopting their hosts' perspectives on everything from agricultural methods to social relationships. Mueller's assignment to the Hoffmann farm had evolved into something resembling apprenticeship. Walter Hoffmann taught him about crop rotation, soil conservation, and mechanical innovations that increased productivity while reducing labor. More importantly, he demonstrated how democratic decision-making worked at the family level, with Emma having equal voice in farm management and children encouraged to express opinions about their futures. The contrast with authoritarian German society could not have been more stark. Here was a social system that produced abundance through cooperation rather than coercion, that encouraged individual initiative while maintaining community bonds, that balanced authority with freedom in ways Nazi ideology claimed were impossible. Letters home began reflecting these observations. "Papa," wrote Friedrich Bauer from his assignment at a dairy farm, "the American farmer treats his hired men as partners rather than subordinates. They share profits from good harvests, make collective decisions about planting, and send their children to schools that teach them to question authority. Yet production exceeds anything we achieved with our superior German discipline." By spring 1944, the prisoner re-education program had produced results that exceeded all expectations. Over 15,000 German prisoners were enrolled in English classes. University professors visited camps to lecture on American history, economics, and political science. Prisoners studied the Constitution, read newspapers freely, and debated democratic principles with enthusiasm that amazed their instructors. The program's success created an unexpected problem: prisoners who no longer wanted to return to Germany. Some had married American women through correspondence programs. Others had been offered partnerships in the farms where they worked. Many simply preferred the prosperity and freedom they had discovered in America to the devastation awaiting them in post-war Germany. Colonel Patterson found himself processing unprecedented numbers of requests for extended stays and eventual immigration. "These men have become Americans in all but citizenship," he noted in his final report. "They understand our values better than many native-born citizens. They've experienced democracy in action and want to be part of it." The final proof of transformation came with Germany's surrender in May 1945. As news of the Third Reich's collapse reached Camp Algona, the expected celebrations never materialized. Instead, prisoners responded with quiet relief that the war was ending and somber reflection on what Germany had become under Nazi leadership. Mueller's reaction was typical of many. "I feel neither victory nor defeat," he wrote to his mother. "Only sadness for all the destruction that could have been avoided and gratitude for the American families who showed me what our countries could become together." The repatriation process, which began in late 1945 and continued through 1946, became a final opportunity for transformation. American authorities provided vocational training, democratic education, and practical preparation for life in post-war Germany. Prisoners departed with skills, knowledge, and perspectives that would prove invaluable in reconstruction efforts. Emma Hoffmann was among hundreds of American farm wives who gathered at Camp Algona's closing ceremony in September 1946. As she embraced Klaus Mueller for what they both knew might be the final time, she pressed into his hands a package containing American seeds for his mother's garden and a letter of introduction to agricultural officials who could help him apply modern farming methods in post-war Germany. "Remember us," she said in the German she had been practicing for 3 years. "Remember that enemies can become family." The statistics tell only part of the story. Of the 425,000 German prisoners held in America during World War II, fewer than 1% attempted escape. Post-war surveys showed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. Most remarkably, thousands maintained correspondence with American families for decades after the war, creating bonds that outlasted the political divisions that had made them enemies. Klaus Mueller returned to Hamburg in December 1946, carrying with him more than personal belongings. He brought agricultural knowledge, democratic ideals, and unshakable faith in the possibility of reconciliation between former enemies. His mother's garden, planted with Iowa seeds sent by Emma Hoffmann, became a local symbol of renewal and hope. In 1952, Mueller immigrated to the United States, settling in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where he established a successful farming operation using techniques learned during his captivity. He married the daughter of the Methodist pastor, whose congregation had sent him Christmas packages, and together they raised 4 children, who grew up hearing stories of how a Thanksgiving dinner had changed the course of their father's life. The transformation that began with a simple invitation to share a holiday meal had rippled outward to reshape individual lives, family relationships, and eventually the post-war alliance between former enemies. In the end, America's greatest victory was not military, but moral, the demonstration that democratic values and human kindness could convert hardened enemies into lifelong friends. The lesson remains relevant decades later. In a world still divided by ideology, ethnicity, and nationalism, the story of German prisoners and Iowa farmers offers enduring proof that bridges can be built across any divide through the simple act of extending an invitation to share a meal, see common humanity, and choose reconciliation over revenge. On Thanksgiving Day 1993, exactly 50 years after that first invitation, Klaus Mueller stood in the same Iowa kitchen where his transformation had begun, surrounded by children and grandchildren, as he carved turkey for a feast that brought together descendants of former enemies in celebration of the abundance that comes from choosing friendship over hatred. The circle was complete, but the story continues in every act of hospitality that crosses cultural boundaries, in every gesture of kindness toward strangers, in every choice to see potential friends rather than permanent enemies. The German prisoners who experienced American Thanksgiving discovered that the most powerful weapon against hatred is not force, but fellowship, not propaganda, but pie, not ideology, but invitation. Their story reminds us that even in the darkest moments of human conflict, ordinary people making extraordinary choices can plant seeds of transformation that bloom long after the battles are forgotten and the treaties are signed. Sometimes the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but at dinner tables, where former enemies discover they are actually family.